All right, and we are 1 minute ahead of schedule, but I think we will continue at this point. And our next speaker is Professor Laurel Buxbaum. Professor Buxbaum is a research professor of rehabilitation medicine at Thomas Jefferson University, and she is also director of Cognition and Action Laboratory at Moss Rehabilitation Research Institute in Philadelphia. She is a leading expert on the neuroscience of bodily action, and in particular including the aspect of neurorehabilitation and clinical conditions such as apraxia. Professor Buxbaum is the recipient of many awards, including Kenneth M. Wiest Award of the American Society of Neurorehabilitation, and her lab has received grant funding from several prestigious bodies, including the NIH. Professor Buxbaum has served as an associate editor of the journals Cortex, Cognition, and Journal of Neuropsychology, and she has also published in the most important journals in cognitive neuroscience, such as Brain, Cognition, and Brain and Cognition, just to name a few examples. Okay, I'm particularly excited about this talk, since it will complement the talks so far with a very different perspective. And that is the perspective of the neural implementation of pantomime. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me, everyone? Okay, and can you see my screen, my slides? Yeah. Okay. Wow. Okay. As you all well know in the Zoom world, this is an amazingly auspicious start. I'm very sorry I can't be there with you all. My grandmother is from Poland. I've never been to Poland, so this would have been a wonderful opportunity. But with the pandemic and travel restrictions and all the other constraints on my time, it was hard. But next time. Okay, so my talk is going to be very, very different than what we just heard, and I think hopefully it will be a complement. I'm going to be talking about shared and distinct neurocognitive processes in language and tool use, focusing on patients who've had a stroke to the left hemisphere. So here's an overview of what I'll talk about today. First, I will just give you a little background on neurocognitive models of language and tool action pantomime. Then I'm going to tell you about limb apraxia and deficits in tool gesture production and recognition. I'll talk a little bit about the brain systems that underlie those two components of pantomime. Then I will tell you a little bit about two different subtypes of tool-driven gestures, focused on the structure of tools, the visual attributes of tools versus what the purpose is and what they're used for. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what role the gesture representation serves in helping predict and produce actions in terms of sort of a notion of forward and inverse models, which comes from the motor control literature, and how these representations are critical for predictive processing and for timely correction of errors. So the first thing I want you to appreciate, those of you who don't study the human brain, is, and most of you probably know this, but just as a review, in the human brain, there is the major architecture that's been known for 150 years or something by now, is that you have these two major regions that are important for speech processing, and they're connected by a band of fibers called the arcuate fasciculus, which, by the way, on some models, the arcuate fasciculus is a part of a larger band of fibers called the superior longitudinal fasciculus. These two regions, the posterior region, which is a temporal and parietal region, is important for speech comprehension, and the anterior region, which is Broca's area and surrounding ventral premotor cortex, is critical for speech production. and also for aspects of semantic retrieval. So the IFG, inferior frontal gyrus, as you know, is really important for a lot of complex tasks, and particularly from extracting meaning from speech and from visual arrays as well. So this connection between this posterior and anterior is really important in language processing, and as I will show you, really important in praxis as well. Now here on the right, I've just shown you an older overlay of the lesions that are associated with apraxia. I'm going to tell you more about what apraxia is in a minute, but I want you to just broadly appreciate that you've got essentially the same architecture, and this overlay of regions extends subcortically and overlaps very considerably with the arcuate fasciculus. So it's the same regions that give you damaged speech, give you damaged praxis. Not 100% overlap, but there's a very strong overlap. And we've known this for a very long time in the literature, that language and tool gestures share large portions of this network. And furthermore, now I'm going to give you a further distinction, a gradation of this network. Both of them have two major pathways, a dorsal pathway and a ventral pathway. And the dorsal route in language is critical for input-output mapping. It takes phonological input and transforms it into motor output via a parietal and frontal route along the superior longitudinal fasciculus. And in action, you have visual input, gestural input, that has to be transformed, let's say for the sake of, for imitation, into a motor output. And so you have this route that is sensitive to statistical regularities in the correspondence between sound and articulation on the one hand, and visual input and arm and hand output on the other hand, this sort of transformatory route. This contrasts with the ventral route, which is critical for extracting meaning from sound or vision. And a very prominent model that many of you may know is the Hickok and Popple model, which has generated a lot of work. And I don't think the details are important, but what this model essentially does is take a feedback and feed forward architecture and implements it in a neural on the neural substrate. Now, I wanted to point out that in my work, I developed a two-root model of action, which has many parallels, and that's part of what I'm going to tell you about today. For the present purposes, the important part of this route is that you have a posterior temporal component, which is critical for concepts of actions, tool actions in the left hemisphere, in the as I said, posterior temporal lobe. And then you have a more dorsal component, which in the parietal lobe, which is critical for, first of all, transforming these representations in the temporal lobe into a plan for action based on where the body is in space and what is needed to change where the body is in space to where it needs to be. That's the sort of predictive route. I'm not going to talk too much about this today, but for those interested, there is an important component that I've studied in much of my work, which is a selection component in which you have sort of candidate actions that are buffered in the supramarginal gyrus and then selected in the based on a signal from the IFG. This selection component is really relevant to competition between actions, and it's for today's this conference, it's not as directly relevant. So I'm going to now tell you about limbapraxia, which is this fascinating disorder, very puzzling and been studied a lot. Well, not as much as aphasia has, but been studied over 100 years, and we still have relatively poor understanding of it. And I really urge many of you, we want and need more researchers in apraxia. So hopefully I'll spark your interest today. So what is the limbapraxia? Well, it's hard to define. It's a cluster of deficits in skilled action, and it's not attributable to weakness or incoordination. So in most patients with stroke, there's some weakness and incoordination in the contralesional arm and hand, in the arm and hand opposite the stroke, in this case, the right one. But apraxia is present in both limbs. So even in the so-called good unimpaired hand, you see these characteristic problems that I'm going to show you in a minute. So it's nothing to do with the motor strength or dexterity or anything. It's a higher level cognitive motor interface problem. And it's quite common. It occurs in about half of all left hemisphere stroke patients, and even more in people who have aphasia. It is a syndrome that is characterized variably by deficits in pantomime of tool actions, in tool use, actual tool use problems, in imitating both meaningful and meaningless novel actions with both hands, and also problems in action recognition and action knowledge. There's been a lot of confusion in the literature about the subtypes of the disorder, for example, ideational and ideomotor apraxia, which I won't spend much time on today either, but I'm happy to tell you more about that. I think this distinction has actually pushed a lot of people away from studying the disorder, because the literature, every time I talk to people who are interested, they say the literature is such a mess. I got scared and it's too hard, so I don't want to study it, but I hope to begin to change that. Okay, now hopefully my videos will play. These are 3 videos of a patient with limb apraxia using her unimpaired left hand. She is asked to pantomime how to use that object on the table, which is a scissors. And in a pre-test, we make sure these patients can recognize and know what the objects are. There's no problem with all of that. And in fact, we also know from other testing that they know many things about these objects, like where they would use it, who would use it, what room of the house it would be found in. There's a particular agnosia of how to use the tool. So she's asked to pantomime, and here's what she does. And you'll see what's been called perplexity, this sort of characteristic problem in even figuring out how to position her fingers. And she's staring at her hand and she just can't get it. And the video would go on. She kind of does this for a really long time and then she gives up. Now, in contrast, when you actually give her the scissors and ask her to pantomime with the tool in hand, it's still a pantomime because there's no recipient object, there's no paper. So she has to show how she would use it. And she takes it without hesitation and positions her fingers appropriately, but notice the trajectory of the action is inappropriate. So you would not be able to cut paper by moving side to side. And in fact, healthy, controlled, neurotypical people and people without apraxia don't go to the side when they're cutting like that, right? So probably if you think about how you would pantomime, you would not do that. So there's a trajectory problem, despite the fact that when the tool's there, she responds to the affordances of the tool and can take it. And this is by way of illustrating what a peculiarly circumscribed deficit this is. Now, to further emphasize that point, when this same subject with the same hand is asked to reach out and grasp things that she sees based on their size and shape, so she has to rotate her wrist appropriately on each trial, and she's got to change her hand posture on each trial from a small pinchy kind of posture to a clench posture. She also performs without any problems. Same patient and same hand. So she orients her wrist normally and appropriately. And so the contrast here is between the current visually guided actions and the actions that come from memory. So she's good with current visual, she's bad with memory-driven actions. And by the way, this is completely opposite pattern as that seen in optic ataxia, another fascinating disorder, which I can tell you more about if you're interested. Okay, so when we started this work, there were the prominent model of how we interact with the visual world was in terms of the two systems hypothesis. which the first of which was developed by Ungerleider in Michigan, and then a more recent version by Goodale and Milner. And in this model, which again may be review for many of you, the dorsal stream is specialized for vision for action, and the ventral stream for vision for perception. And the dorsal stream is critical for, again, currently guided movements and eye movements too, actually, based on current visual targets, visual objects in the world, whereas the ventral stream is critical for object knowledge and semantic knowledge. But when you think about it, this two-stream model, which has been justly extremely influential, doesn't explain what you just saw, because we saw a distinction in those videos between two types of action. One of them was memory-guided action, and one of them was visually guided action. And so we needed to develop a further refinement of the two-stream model, which we did in 2001, and then elaborated in several other recent papers, including this one. And the model basically distinguishes the coordinate frame, whether the movements are made vis-a-vis the body, the internal structure and posture of the body versus objects in the world, whether it's the actions are visually dependent or not, and what are the tool attributes that are being responded to. And that this distinguishes a dorso-dorsal stream, which is bilateral, which is critical for reaching to and grabbing things, versus a left lateralized ventrodorsal system, which is critical for tool use. And it's called the tool use network in humans. And you can kind of see here that the attributes that I talked about are different: visual objects in the environment versus remembered trajectories and postures based on body frame of reference, stronger role of visual guidance versus a stronger role of prediction, that memory serves as a target for what the object is supposed to look and feel like when it's enacted. And the attributes of the tool that are responded to. So the dorsal stream is affordance-driven and structure-based versus the ventrodorsal stream, which is memory-driven and function-based. And in apraxia, you don't have the ventrodorsal stream, but you have the dorso-dorsal stream. So what we've done in a lot of our work is really tried to refine what this ventrodorsal stream is doing versus the dorso-dorsal stream. And we do a lot of this via lesion symptom mapping. So this is an example of 71 brains on people who have gotten an MRI scan, and then we demarcate the lesions by hand and rotate them, morph them onto a common atlas. And then we get an overlay. We can see that across this cohort of 71 patients, we've got a very good coverage of the left hemisphere. And we want a good coverage because we want to make sure that we can sample which voxels in the brain, when lesioned, are critical for a given behavior. And we do that with a variety of statistical approaches. I'm sorry that there's a weird black thing there. So in my animations were out of order. Okay, so what we're doing here is looking at the voxels that, when lesioned, are critical for various types of tool use actions. The first one is pantomime to the site of a tool. And you can see here that although you do get some frontal parietal, you get this very heavy significance. These are voxels that significantly predict bad pantomime, and they're in the ventral posterior part of the temporal lobe and in the middle temporal gyrus. So that knowledge of how to produce that pantomime is really critically stored in that area. When people are imitating meaningful gestures, imitation now, so not to the site of a tool, but to someone else, the regions that are critical are both that posterior temporal region as well as a lot more of that frontal parietal system. So we're getting this need to translate the input of someone gesturing into a representation of your own body, for which the parietal lobe is critical. And that's not seen as much with tool use. tool gesture to the side of tools, in contrast to pantomiming imitating meaningless actions. And this is a stimulus from Jörg Goldenberg, who, of course, I hope many of you know because he has done wonderful work on pantomime. And here we see much less posterior temporal, and we see the same frontal parietal. So what we then can do is conjoin two of the above, two of what I just showed you, and look at the voxels common to tool-related actions, both gesture to sight of tools and tool imitation, and the voxels common to imitation, whether it's tool-related or meaningless. And so these are the tool-related action voxels. These are the imitation voxels, and it's quite possible that this, rather than the confusion in the literature, is what we might want to use to distinguish sort of ideational apraxia, loss of an idea of what the action is supposed to be, versus ideomotor apraxia, which is a translational deficit. And for those of you who had studied or talked about mirror neurons when that was all the rage, I say that a little bit sardonically, because I feel like in science, one of the things we do is we latch onto ideas and excitedly study them, and then we go drift and do another idea. So anyway, IFG is not critical for any of these actions, and IFG is a part of the human mirror neuron system. So that's kind of interesting. And then another further distinction I want you to think about is between the postural versus the kinematic aspects of action. So the postural aspects of, when I say action, I mean tool use gestures. The postural components are very closely linked to the actual tool. So the way you position your hand is really linked to tool representations, tool knowledge that we know from many fMRI studies is also represented in the posterior temporal lobe, versus the shape and size and amplitude and timing, which is much more a frontal parietal component. So the tool specific hand component of the gesture versus the arm, the scale and timing, which is adjusted online. So these are the sort of two components of the action system. And then moreover, I know I'm showing you a lot, but we can come back with questions later. When you parse out the regions critical for recognition versus production, and we do this by residualizing one set of scores against the other to remove their common variance, and we look at the variance and scores that are unique to recognition on the one hand versus production on the other. And again, we see this division between the temporal and the frontal parietal. Okay, so I've kind of made that hopefully clear. And then this is a literature review article that also showed a similar pattern, that these Black studies, it's about 15 studies, both fMRI and structural imaging in patients, that really showed that recognition tends to be more posterior, and then production. This looks like there's some production also in the temporal lobe, but that you get this sort of production component that's more frontal parietal. Okay, so that's been clear. One more thing in this stream of thought is that when you overlay the posterior temporal significance maps on a mask of human movement cortex, which is HMT+, it overlaps quite considerably. So this red blob, might be hard to see, is overlaid upon all the blue, purple, and green, which are the voxels that, when lesioned, give you gesture recognition deficit. So what we think this suggests is that in the posterior temporal lobe, what you have are tool-specific representations of body to tool postures and movements in a visual format in the temporal lobe, transformed into a kinesthetic format as it passes anteriorly into the parietal lobe for production. And that this posterior temporal lobe is the time component, is what's been called the space-time form picture of the movement way back in close to the turn of the last century. Whereas in the supramarginal gyrus and in sensory and motor cortex, you're getting these statistical regularities in input and output, enabling imitation, positioning of the body in space over time. Okay, so we know that there are parallels between language and gesture in the neural architecture and even in the subcomponents. And in fact, we know that gestures facilitate verb retrieval in aphasia. So this is from a picture from a very often used method in aphasia treatment, which is called VNEST, Verb Network Strengthening Treatment, in which people are shown a verb picture of an action that they have to name. And in addition to naming it, they're trained to really retrieve the gestures associated with the action, as well as a lot of other components. I'm sorry, I thought I had another slide there, another image there. But we know that gesture and language can facilitate one another. Okay. This is the third segment of the talk. And in this section, I want to briefly focus on a new distinction that I haven't mentioned yet, which is structure-driven versus function-driven components of tool gestures. So when you look at an object like this, which is a MIDI controller, even if you don't know how to use it, which I don't, but my husband is a professional keyboard player, so that's why I even think about these things. So you could, without knowing what it really is for, you could reach out and interact with it. Or you could pantomime interacting with it and twisting the dials and pushing the buttons based on what you see in front of you. But in order to use it skillfully in accordance with its function or assigned function, because these button and knobs can be assigned to do different things and make different sounds, you would have to have a memory. You'd have to have knowledge of what it is based on its purpose. So that's the function structure distinction. Based on this two-root architecture that I talked about, we hypothesized that patients with apraxia would do a lot better with structure-driven than function-driven actions, both in producing them and even in learning them when they're novel and unknown. So this is an example of the kind of study we've done in my lab over the years. This is a former postdoc, Laura Barty, and she made videos in which she produces different kinds of actions with different kinds of hand postures. And then we showed patients these novel finished tools, which have a purpose that are unknown to the subjects and unknown to me. We can kind of think about what they might have been used for, but we don't know. And then we did a training paradigm in which we paired these actions with the tools. And in half the trials, they were a high afforded pairing. So the gesture might be, something like this with that tool. And for the low afforded tools, it might be something like this. It's sort of hard to imagine how you can't pick it up and use it with that. And we wanted to know whether the apraxics would have particular problems with the low afforded tools. And indeed, they did. They were worse than the non-apraxic left CVAs in learning. This was a recognition task, actually. After training them, we asked them to match the gesture with one of 4 possible tools. And they did particularly badly when those tools were low afforded. Moreover, the lesions that are critical for these for the low afforded tools tend to be more ventral than overall apraxia. So here we see apraxia is the medium blue, and the benefit of structure information, but the people who did better with high than low are green, and the intersection is light blue. So among the apraxics, the people who benefited from structure had relative preservation of the more dorsal part of the network. Their lesions were more ventral, so they still had this, so they could do that structure. Now I'm going to switch gears again, and in this section, I'm going to talk more about this gesture target that I mentioned earlier, what the action should look and feel like and what it does for us. So in terms of predictive processing, so a way we can think about the role of feedback and feed-forward driven tool actions is to think about standing in a friend's shower, a shower in a hotel, where you're trying to get the water to a certain temperature. And you turn the dial and it gets scaldingly hot. And then you turn it down. And after a minute, of being way too hot and burning yourself, it gets icy cold. And then you turn it a little bit, it's too hot, it's too cold. So you're using feedback, which is delayed, to adjust your actions in response to sensory input. Versus when you're in your own shower, you know exactly how and where to position your hand and the dial. But let's talk about the hand, because that's what we're thinking about today. You turn it just the right little amount, and the water is that blessed, wonderful temperature that you love. So that's a kind of intuition about feed forward and feedback driven processing. And feed forward is a lot better, obviously. It reduces errors, it makes you faster. And one of the parallels that I find fascinating that I started to work on relatively recently is looking at the role of feedback and feed forward driven actions and their parallels in language. So there's a fascinating phenomenon called conduite d'approche in language, and I'm going to show you an example of it. So here is a patient with conduction aphasia. Conduction aphasia is a disconnection along the arcuate fasciculus with intact broca's and intact Wernicke's. And this patient's supposed to name this picture, which hopefully you will all recognize, unless maybe I'm so old that this is no longer an iconic image, but I think it is. Okay, so this is Audrey Holland, wonderful, wonderful scientist. She's supposed to name this picture. So you see that wonderful video, right? So you see this struggle and self-correction when she hears herself making a mistake. And it's associated, as I said, with lesions, both the temporal parietal junction, which Greg Hickok thinks is the most critical part, as well as. Oh, you're kidding me. Oh, geez. Well, it's a video of an aphasic patient. So yes, you should have heard the sound. I don't know what to do about that. Okay. Okay. All right.
How about these?
Can you hear this?
Not each individual.
Can you hear it?
The group.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
They're the B.
No, can you hear it?
Bibles. No, Bible. No, not Bibles.
Keep going.
Oh, gosh. Bibbles. Bubbles. No. Bible. Oh, not a Bible.
B, try B.
Yeah, it's a B. It's a Bibbles.
Try an E. Try an E.
It's okay. I just listen.
Yeah, that's right. T. Yeah, you
The
got
battle. The Beatles.
Yes, yes.
Beatles.
Okay.
All right. Now I'm going to, let's see. I don't see how to, I'm going to have to reshare my screen, share screen, portion of screen, share And then I'm have to go into presenter view again, slideshow. Okay, hold on a second, slideshow, presenter view. Okay, can you see my screen again? Oh, shit. Can you hear me? And you can see me, see the screen, right? Okay. All right. Anyway, and you heard that video, right? I don't care if you saw it. There wasn't any, it was the point of, could you hear the correction, the self-corrections? Okay. All right. Okay. Let's go on. Okay. So this kind of behavior has been modeled in both computational models as well as these kind of theoretical models in terms of what is going on here in this dorsal stream, where you're trying to, you have a target, an auditory target of what the action, what the articulation should sound like when produced. And it needs to be translated, and there needs to be a prediction there to catch errors online before they occur. So there's this internal monitor. But what these patients don't have is that prediction. And so what they've got to do is speak, hear it, hear the sound, hear that they're making a mistake, and gradually and iteratively clean up the error. It's a very slow process. And interesting, and so this is this external monitoring with auditory comprehension, and it requires that posterior component is intact. And we think that we have seen parallel behaviors in gesture pantomime. And we think that the integrity of gesture comprehension, the target, and whether you can see your hand are critical in whether you can clean up the error that these apraxic patients make, and that you need an intact temporal lobe. So let me show you conduit approach in limb apraxia, which is very parallel. People are shown things like this scissors and asked to pantomime. And notice the many postures that she goes through and how she looks. She's looking at her hand, her face. No, not it. Flipping the wrist over. It's not quite right. People have called this conduction apraxia. It's quite common because, and so she knows something's wrong. And so the question is, and she did not get it right, but the question is, what is the role of visual feedback in actually ending up on the right, in the right place? And by the way, the lesions that are associated with this conduit approach are very much in the arc of fasciculus and in the posterior temporal, the TPJ, temporal parietal junction, which Greg Hickok thinks is so critical in conduction aphasia, is also critical in conduction apraxia. And this is a support vector regression, lesion symptom mapping, a machine learning approach by which we more sophisticated than some of the other earlier stuff. Now, what is the role of vision? So I'll show you another example of conduit approach first, just because I love these videos. He's supposed to be showing how to use a key. And there's that body part of object, which we mentioned in the discussion as being a little more primitive and earlier developmentally in children. And he thinks that that's correct. He wants to go on, but a lot of times with vision, people are much more likely, these patients are much more likely to get the correct answer than without vision. VF is visual feedback, NVF is no visual feedback. This is the percent of their errors that they correct, they end up on the correct one versus that they never get it right, okay? So on the external monitoring account, the other thing is that not only do you need vision, but you need to know what the action is supposed to look like, that gesture target. And those should interact to predict error correction attempts and successful resolution. So this slide's a little complicated, but it's worth walking through. So here we have Each subject plotted twice, once in each condition. No visual feedback, NVF, is light colored, and visual feedback is dark. And here is, on this x-axis, is their action comprehension. So each subject also gets an action comprehension score. And this is their proportion of successful error correction. And we plot each, and then no visual feedback here is a flat across, is completely horizontal. Whereas with visual feedback, you have a really nice correlation. And if you have good action comprehension and visual feedback, you end up getting the answer right, getting the gesture right. If you have bad action comprehension, it doesn't matter if you can see your hand or not. Of course, you don't know what it's supposed to look like, so it doesn't matter. So this is just what I just said. Visual feedback increases successful error resolution, but only when gesture comprehension is intact. Okay, so my last section, both language and tool actions depend on a left lateralized system. They have a two-stream architecture with a ventral and a dorsal component mediated by the temporal versus the frontal parietal lobe. They both rely on intact target representations of the predicted sensory consequences of a given action, and they show parallel consequences of disconnection between sensory target representations and motor output systems, conduit approach. And they're also likely, which I didn't spend much time on, to intersect at the level of meaning. Gesture facilitates verb retrieval, as I showed you. And here is a very complicated model from language domain, the aphasia domain, that I wanted to show you, just because here we have the idea that there's a common conceptualizer, a semantic component into which feeds the gestuary, which is this sort of gesture engrams. And we can talk about this complicated, we have this gesture planner, we have a lexicon, et cetera. But the important point here is that there's a common concept for which both gestures and language, to which both gestures and language contribute and access. But they also differ in an important way, which is the sensory modality over which prediction occurs in the dorsal stream. Tool gesture representations specify how the body should look and feel when the motor action is produced by the arm and hand, whereas phonological representations specify how an utterance should sound when the motor action is produced by the articulatory apparatus. So the ventral stream is in common, the dorsal streams differ. And this suggests to me, I was just sort of brainstorming last night, and in our recent work, we've started to pursue this, that in patients with left hemisphere stroke, we should see strong associations between action recognition and semantic action knowledge, mediated by that common action semantics in the ventral stream. And we should see dissociation between deficits in the two tasks that are iconic for the dorsal stream, which are non-word repetition, input-output, phonological articulatory mapping without meaning, and meaningless imitation, which is input-output mapping without meaning. And recent work in our lab by one of my current postdocs is supporting this prediction. I didn't have time to pull that together to show you. And it further suggests that the facilitation of speech output from gesture occurs in a specific stage of semantic access. And I wanted to just end with one other thought, which is something outside of what I study, which is syntax. Recent work suggests that gesture and language may share syntactic capacities and neural substrates as well. So there are many interesting directions for the future. And I wanted to thank you so much, and also a special shout out and thanks to my lab here on Zoom, an image familiar to many of you, and also a lot of my collaborators with whom this work would not be possible, and my funding from the NIH. Thank you very much for your attention, and let me know if you have any questions.
Now the floor is open to questions. There is, I think, one over there already from Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great talk.
Thank you. Hi, Michael.
Hi. So, what you've done is you've given us a lot of insight into this subdivision of the dorsal stream, dorsodorsal, dorsiventral. What I'm worried about is you've thrown away the ventral stream, and I'm sort of fond of the ventral stream. And I want to offer a thought for you to address. In all the studies you've shown us, there are absolutely no decisions to be made. In other words, you're just shown an object, please interact with it or pantomime it. Whereas in real life and in real narratives, we have a scene in which we are engaged and we have to make decisions, we have to see what the relations are between the pieces, and we choose a course of action. And I would like to think that the ventral stream is important once you get to that stage. And so I wonder whether, from your much deeper knowledge of the brain than I have, whether you would agree to that, or whether you think we don't need the ventral stream in real life.
Great question. Thank you, Michael. Well, I didn't show you, I have this, frankly, a wealth of work on selection of gesture from when you're presented with arrays. It's, in fact, probably the core of what I'm most interested in is competition between gestures and how we select the appropriate one. And absolutely, the competition, the ventral stream, I'm sorry you thought I threw it away. That's a bit odd, to be honest, since I showed you many images of the ventral stream. The posterior temporal lobe that's the ventral stream. That's in gesture, unlike in language, and where in language where you actually have an anterior connection through the anterior temporal lobe up through the uncinate fasciculus to the eye of G, and that's a full two-root loop. We don't think in gesture you go that way, but we don't think you go all the way anterior. We think that both meaningful and meaningless actions project up from posterior temporal through the parietal and then on to the frontal, because they have to be enacted with the body rather than the vocal apparatus. And so that split, the difference is there. Now, let's get back to the competition question. So when you see an array of objects, things that compete with each other do so for a variety of interesting reasons, which parallel the interesting reasons for competition in language. And that has to do with semantic feature overlap. I could go off on this topic for a lot longer, but when gestures look similar to one another, they are closer in gesture space. They are close semantic neighbors, and they interfere with each other more. So if you put down on the table a fishing rod and a hammer and told me to pick the hammer, then the fishing rod, even though it's far in other semantic ways, right? It's used outdoors versus indoors. It's used for fishing and not not building. It differs in so many ways, but its gesture causes competition. And we have a lot of eye tracking studies that show that you'll look at that fishing rod a lot more than you'll look at something that is not used with the similar gesture as a hammer. So tool use competition is action related in part, and a very fascinating. And yes, that's the ventral stream. So we can talk a lot more about that and what happens in real life actions with, we have some naturalistic action studies where in coffee making tasks and all this kind of stuff. And I'm happy to talk about that as well.
Hello, I'm Paula Marentet, and I'm just saying that because I'm going to email you and ask you for something, and now you'll know who's asking you. Can you tell me what the right answer for pantomime scissors is and why that's right? I'm going to be talking tomorrow about 3-year-olds with this exact issue of what's the form supposed to look like. So I'm curious.
How we know what the right answer is?
Yeah.
Okay. So the process is an iterative one in which we first watch a lot of age-matched neurotypical controls, older folks, and we get we tune our eye, we train ourselves to see what they're doing, whether they don't have brain damage, and what is an acceptable response. Our instructions very clearly tell people we don't want body part as objects. So we actually correct that the first time someone, on the first trial where we see that, we remind them. So we tell them, we want you to pretend we really want a pantomime of pretending you're holding and using the object. So you really have to imagine that object in your hand. That's the thing that's really hard for a lot of these patients. The control subjects can do that with instruction just fine. So we tune our eye, we watch a lot of normals, and then we code the healthy subjects, and we have a very careful coding scheme, which you're welcome to, and it's actually published, in which we code hand posture, arm posture, and amplitude and timing. So we separate out what's the hand doing? Is it in the right position and orientation? Is the arm in the right position and orientation? And then is it too big or too small, too many or too few? And we code those separately for the control subjects. And we tweak our coding system if we are failing too many of the controls. Like, so if the coding seems to, like, we've done this iteratively, it's exhausting. But, if the controls are doing really badly because some coder is too harsh. And then we also do a lot of reliability code checks between our coders, both initially to train them. They have a reliability set they need to pass, to be within 85% agreement. And then we periodically redo the reliability to make sure no one's drifting. So yeah, it's a complicated process. Thank you for asking.
Hi, very good talk. I have two questions. The first is that the overlap on the dorsal part, structurally, both structurally and functionally, do you think it's more hierarchically like syntax, or semantically like what we understand the pantomime or other? And the second question is that if this apraxia, I'm curious about that, if the apraxia also includes subcortical structures lesion like the basal ganglia.
Interesting idea about syntax and the role of the basal ganglia in syntax. There's a really nice recent paper from someone who's about to come be a postdoc with us, Simon Thibault, Thibault, which just came out in Science, and he's a humble guy, and I didn't even know his paper was going to be in Science. But it's showing that when you train people on syntactically complex structures, their tool actions get better and vice versa. And in the scanner, they showed that's mediated by the basal ganglia, which is so cool. But what I think in the dorsal stream, I think, yes, temporal information is very important. I don't know about hierarchy per se, but I do know that what's important is what happens when. And so you're buffering candidate actions for selection in the right place and the right time. And it helps you know what comes first, what comes second, and that has a syntactic-like feeling. Now, on the other tidbit, unlike in the semantic system where you throw away time information, you want to abstract out over multiple repeated occurrences of having seen something, having felt something, and abstract out its core. So for a pantomime of a hammer in the ventral stream, you can hammer like this with a tiny little hammer. You can hammer big on the ceiling or big on the wall. It's all recognizable as hammering. But what's critical here is the oscillation from the elbow and the clenched posture are invariant. Across time, the dorsal stream is very sensitive to time. What happens when? One more tidbit about syntax. What is interesting to me too is that in the posterior temporal lobe, there is something syntactic in the sense that the thematic association between a tool and its recipient object, what acts on what, it seems to be a part of that tool use information. And so when you think about a syntactic frame of who's doing what to whom, that thematic associate it's hard to say whether that's a sort of dorsal or ventral, and maybe that posterior temporal component acts in both, is important for both streams. And I don't know, I'm happy to talk more about that as well.
Okay, so we also have some questions on Zoom. The first one from Stephen Brown. Stephen writes, can you please comment on the imagined object body part as object distinction for pantomime? Does apraxia impact both types of pantomime comparably? Is the neural representation the same for both types?
Interesting question. Well, so apraxics make a lot of body part as object errors, which are interesting in that they suggest that there is some knowledge of how the tool is supposed to move, but not how the hand is supposed to be positioned if it were holding the tool. You saw the example of the gentleman who was going like this. Now, he also didn't get the twisting right. So he even didn't really get, that wasn't even a good body part as object error. But you see a lot of stuff like this, where people seem to know that the toothbrush moves up and down, but not that the hand would be like this. So the answer to so they make a lot of those errors. Now, I don't know the answer to the second part of your question is whether there are different substrates of tool body part as object errors versus other kinds of hand positioning errors. And that's a really good question. We could go and look at our hand posture errors, because they're all coded, and see how many of them were body part as errors, and then look at the neural substrates of those. Other groups may have looked at that, and I'm not remembering. That your Goldenberg group is a good place to look for the answer to that question.
And another question from Monika Boruta-Żywiczyńska. Monika writes, very well explained. I am fascinated how easily such difficult topics can be presented. I have a more general question. Do you also observe neurogenesis when people suffering from various lesions practice gestures pantomime? Does it help in recovery so much that you can see changes in an MRI scan voxel structure? Thank you.
Thank you for another really great, these are all great questions. So there is a small literature on pantomime rehabilitation, and there are some really nice studies by Nicola Smania, S-M-A-N-I-A, which show that practicing pantomimes in a variety of contexts with a variety of support, with and without the tool in hand, imitation and not imitation, gesture to sight and not, does facilitate not only pantomime, but even more importantly, actual real tool use in these subjects. Another approach, so that's really a practice-based, very sensory motor, the way you would practice learning any sport, for example. That contrasts with another treatment approach that we recently tried in a small study. I'm blocking on which of my students was the first author on that study. I'll think about it in a minute. In which we used that V-nest type approach that I showed you in the talk, verb network strengthening treatment, in which you co-retrieve different facets of the gesture while you're thinking about other semantic attributes. So this was a semantic priming treatment that we tried, where we said, how would you use the tool? Show me. Who would use that tool? A carpenter. Where would they use that tool? In the workshop. Show me again how you would use the pantomime. Where would he use it? Who would use it? What would he use it on? And so you're co-activating over many, many trials, all of the semantic associates. It's a ventral stream treatment as opposed to the other one, which is a dorsal stream treatment. And indeed, it actually helped. We were 3 subjects. 2 of the 3 benefited from this treatment. The sample was way too small to look at any neuroanatomic substrates, but that would be fascinating to see after training. Do you see better connectivity or better activation of either the ventral or dorsal stream, depending on the treatment? Now, we all just need the NIH to give me the money to do, and anyone else who wants to collaborate. Thank you.
So 1 minute, so perhaps one last short question, if there is one. If not, then we are about to conclude this session. Let me just remind everyone that we are about to have a 15-minute break, and after that we'll have the panel, so I hope participants can stay with us for the panel as well. And with that, I want to thank you very much again for the talk, and this is time for a final round of applause.